Let me begin by saying that the inexperienced painter or beginner is immediately recognized by the immensity and variety of detail he or she introduces into their drawings and paintings. The beginner will employ 50 different shapes in one composition, and it's obvious that any relationship between one shape and another is purely coincidental. The beginner or inexperienced painter will also work in 20 different values, and these are distributed with no obvious understanding of how they need to be distributed. The beginner also will use many colors, but they have no design pattern and no relationship to each other. The beginner is also overly concerned with subject matter. He or she will record the unimportant details and textures with loving concern, and the beginner is usually completely oblivious of the fact that in the process he is doing unintentional violence to the basic form that he is drawing or painting, with all of that detail that is being applied. When the beginner draws or paints something, he or she will feel as though everything needs to be included that is there, that they are drawing or painting. The beginner hasn't learned how to edit the subject yet, and therefore everything's included. And what they wind up with is something that looks like a chaotic mess. It will look cluttered, like someone's cluttered attic. In other words, the beginner or inexperienced artist doesn't know how to simplify, which means that they don't know how to work economically. Simplifying is all about working economically. The purpose of art is to put some order into nature, and not to record the infinite and accidental discord of nature. The artist needs to apply economy, which means that he, for example, doesn't use 50 different kinds of colors. He uses a limited number of colors, so maybe just yellow and red, and then creates variations of those colors. The artist who works economically will end up with a much more successful looking painting than if he, for example, included a multitude of different shapes like you see here. And if you do that, then you're cluttering up your picture and not working economically. It's much better to select a limited number of shapes and then use those to create a pattern and variations of that shape. So for example, here you see different shapes, and they are all different because each of them shows a different subject. Each subject that you select will have a different shape. And if you select a lot of different subjects, you're going to end up with a lot of different shapes. And they're going to clutter up your picture. And you won't have the economy that is the hallmark of a really good picture. Pattern. As I mentioned, that's what you need to establish. A pattern with a limited number of colors, shapes, textures, values. Instead of having 50 different values in your painting, you have a limited number of values. You may have, let's say, a dark, and each of these represents a range of values that I'm going to indicate. And then you may have a middle value. So I have established 3 values here: a dark, a light, and a middle value. They make up what is called a value pattern or tonal structure. And I'm only using 3 values. I'm not using 10, 15 different values. But each of these basic values, the dark, the middle value, and the light value, will have variations within them. Each of these values represent a range of values. Here, for this dark, This represents a range of dark values. This represents a range of light values. And this represents a range of middle values. But this is the way you start to plan your composition, with just a few values like this. 2 or 3. You could go 4, but keep it more simple. The more simple, the more powerful the value pattern can be. So you start in a simple way like this, not with a lot of different values. There are only 3 ways in which you can combine the elements of design. So first of all, you need to know what the elements of design are. And you'll learn all of those through my complete illustration art course. But what I will mention here is one of the elements is color, the other is shape, and the other is value. So these elements of design that I just mentioned, they can only be combined in 3 ways, as I said. One of those ways is through repetition. Another way is to combine them to form variations. And the third is novelty, where you introduce something totally different, something that contrasts strongly with all of the other elements. I think I'm also going to add economy to this list, since much of what I'm talking about has to do with economy. In addition, you need to think in terms of objects. Each of these shapes is a shape of an object. Even this figure is considered an object. Now, it's important to also think in terms of object because, for example, this sailboat here, I could repeat that sailboat. So I have another sailboat over here. And I'm doing this really rough, as you can see. So what I have here is repetition, which is one of the ways you can combine shapes. You can combine them to form repetition, which I just did. It's not exact repetition. I'm not being precise here. So I'm combining them to form repetition. And the sailboat is an object. So what I'm doing is I'm repeating an object, the sailboat, and I'm also repeating the shape of that object, of that sailboat. And I'm also repeating the value. They both have this dark value to them. So it's seen this way: repetition of object and repetition of shape. However, if I do this and I add, let's say, a sail here that this sailboat doesn't have, and I enlarge the sailboat somewhat, like this, what I now have is repetition of object in both sailboats, but I now have variation of shape, because this shape doesn't look exactly like that one. I no longer have repetition. I now have repetition with variation of shape. But the object remains the same. They're both sailboats. As you can see, I've also changed the size of this second sailboat. So there is variation introduced in terms of size as well. Now, if I do this, let's say I add a figure here, really rough figure standing over here on the land area. Got the hand up, maybe waving, and I'll add some water here, reflection in the water. I'm not going to do a finished drawing here. This is just a rough sketch to show you what I've been talking about. And then some clouds maybe in the sky like that. You see two sailboats here, and then I introduce the figure. By introducing the figure into this little rough sketch, what I've done is I've introduced novelty, something that is completely different from these two sailboats, a human figure. But this little sketch also has variation. I've varied the sailboat when I repeated it by changing its size and shape somewhat. But it's still recognizable as a sailboat. I haven't changed the shape so much that it has lost its association or identity with this first sailboat. When you repeat an element of design such as a shape, like I'm showing you here, that second shape or third shape or fourth shape, however many repetitions with variation you have, they must all not be so different that they lose their identity with the first shape or element of design. If they look too different, then you will have lost the pattern and also rhythm and unity as well as harmony. You will have lost all of those things because you will have introduced too much variety. And that's the trouble with some pictures, where the artist introduces so much variety that all of those things that I mentioned are lost. And there's no longer a connection between the shapes or other elements of design. So when you create variations, make sure that you don't change the element of design, in this case shape, so much that it no longer resembles the other shape or shapes. The one element of design that you can't change too much when you repeat it is shape. And that's because if you repeat that shape and you change it too much, you will have lost the association between the shapes formed by their similarity. You can, however, vary all of the other elements of design within those shapes, thereby introducing variety. And you can introduce a lot of variety. But don't change the shapes too radically when you repeat them, or you will have lost unity, a feeling of oneness. You will have lost also the feeling of harmony between those shapes, because harmony results from similarity of shapes. But like I said, you can then introduce variations of the other elements of design in order to create interest in those repetitions with variations of shape. So for example, I could add, let's say, a red sail here, and then for the other sail I could add this yellow orange, and then maybe I could add a stripe here like this, a couple of stripes, and then repeat that yellow on the red. So you see I'm adding variations to those shapes. I'm changing their color. I could also change their intensity of color or saturation. I could make the sailboat red, more saturated looking, while the color on this sailboat is more desaturated. You see how I'm introducing variations within these shapes to add more interest. So it's repetition with variation, and those variations are what I've just introduced, the different colors, the different saturation of colors. And I can continue adding other elements of design to vary these shapes even more in order to add even more interest, without changing their shapes too radically so that they lose their identity, their association to each other. What I've also done here is I've used a limited number of shapes. I have the shape of the figure, and then I have the shape of the sailboat. I haven't introduced a lot of different shapes. I'm using this principle of economy that I mentioned earlier. The beginner will add everything that you see here to this picture. Too many shapes. Now, what also is important is the pattern. Now, a pattern is set up when you have at least a shape or whatever element of design you have repeated at least 3 times. That sets up a pattern. So what I could do maybe is add another sailboat in the foreground here. Now what I could do, for example, is add an orange color here. But the problem is now I got too many different colors. This is not following the principle of economy. And also, there's no dominance established. And when you have no dominance, you have no unity. So there needs to be a dominance of one color. So what I could do is I could add a red, repeating the red on that sailboat further back. But when I repeat that red, I'm varying it, thereby introducing here variation. So now I have a dominance of red because there is more of the red color than there is of the yellow-orange here. So economy has been applied to shapes. I took one shape, this one here, and then I repeated that shape with variations. And then I introduced novelty because of the figure that I added. So I have a limited number of objects and shapes that I'm working with. I'm working with economy. Now I could introduce another object, another shape. So in order to keep this side from appearing too empty, I could maybe add a bush here. So all this is the land area, and then there's a bush right there, fills up that space. Now if I add another bush, I'm repeating this shape, but with variation. So over here, for example, I could add a bush. Now I haven't introduced another new object with another new shape. What I've done is I've just repeated this bush with variation. So now it has a different size, it's smaller, and it doesn't have the exact same shape that this has. Even though the two bushes don't look exactly the same, they aren't so different that they no longer resemble each other. And therefore, they still appear to have an association with each other. I haven't changed the repetition of that bush so much that it is no longer identifiable as a similar bush to this one. The whole idea of economy is to do more with less. This kind of economy that I've been talking about extends also to color. The beginner, not knowing about the importance of applying economy to color, will add all sorts of different colors. Well, the beginner might say, I like this blue, so I'm going to add that blue to the sky like this, and then I'm going to add a nice green to the ground here, and to these bushes also, something like this maybe, a darker green, and then maybe a nice blue-green for the water. Beginner is also unaware of the importance of varying the saturation of the color. So many of the colors that he or she puts down will be too saturated. Too many of them will be overly saturated. And then let's say the beginner also thinks about maybe adding a nice violet color to this figure standing here like that. And let's say this sail here should have a bright yellow on it. Like that. That's nice. So the beginner is pretty much going by what he or she likes. I like this color, I like that color, so I'm going to put that in. And I need to add more color so that the whole painting looks more colorful. And let's see, maybe I should add a darker blue here to the water like that. So now there's a different blue added to this picture than the blue in the sky. And then the beginner might say, well, what color haven't I used yet? Oh yeah, what about the orange here? Yeah, let me use that orange, and I think I'll place that on that sail over there, and then maybe another orange color here, or maybe it should be a red-orange, something like that. That's better. So the beginner uses every color of the rainbow, and he or she doesn't know that that doesn't make a good picture. It makes an incredibly bad picture. The way to begin is to select a limited number of colors that you're going to use. I think I'm going to list the colors that I used in this sketch over here by picking up the various colors from the sketch. So here's a yellow that is used, and there's a red, the blue of the water, the blue-green of the sky. Then there's the yellow-orange of the sail in the background there. Then there is the green. And the blue-violet on the man. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 colors that have been used for this color sketch, which means that there is no economy of color here. So in order to achieve economy of color, I need to use fewer colors. Now here's what you need to understand. These 7 colors are colors that have been selected to make up the color scheme. And when I talk about using fewer colors, I'm talking about those colors that will make up the color scheme. And that color scheme needs to consist of only a few colors, 2, 3, or 4 at the most. And then you create variations of those colors, and I have variations listed right over here. And when you create those variations, additional colors will be added to the painting. But the dominant colors will be those few colors that you selected for your color scheme. They will dominate, and those other colors will be secondary in importance. They will be variations of those dominant colors that make up the color scheme. So that's why you can have only, let's say, 2 or 3 colors for the color scheme, but you actually will end up with a lot more colors because of the variations that you create from those 2 or 3 colors that make up the color scheme. You could also use just one color for your color scheme and then create variations of that one color in terms of different degrees of saturation of color and different values. Here you can see that I changed the colors. I used fewer of them, and it no longer looks like all the colors of the rainbow have been used. A much more pleasing, harmonious, and unified, and interesting looking painting results from this use of fewer colors, resulting in color economy. So in this painting, I used a blue, and I used a red, and I used a green. And then I created variations of the blue, the red, and the green, resulting in what you see here. So here you see an example of using a limited number of colors to get that color economy, but you don't just end up with the 3 colors which represent what the color scheme is. You end up with additional colors because of the variations that are made from those limited number of colors. And thereby you get plenty of color variety, which adds tremendous amount of interest to a painting. I can't go into color too much here because you can't learn everything from one video. There's just too much to learn. But what I will say is, for example, the variations that I'm talking about are, if I take a blue like that, and then I add a little bit of the red, what I get is a blue-violet. Or if I mix these colors in the right proportion, I get a violet, a little more red. So you see, I'm getting additional colors that help to create even more color variety. Even though I've introduced color variations here, it is the basic colors that I selected for my color scheme, which are blue, red, and green, that dominate. And those variations of color are subdominant. They are of secondary importance, as I mentioned. And they are not allowed to overwhelm the dominant colors that I selected for the color scheme. If that would happen, then the color scheme that I selected would no longer be blue, red, and green. It would go into other colors, and the color scheme would then be lost. In this little rough color sketch, there is repetition of color, like the blue has been repeated, but then the blue is varied, so there is variation. And I also introduced novelty, which means strong contrast. And the strong contrast results from the red that I've used here on the sailboat and on the hat of the man, as well as this sailboat back here. So the red is the novelty that has been introduced. So all three of these are present within this little rough color sketch. This color sketch also represents what is called color design. And there's a lot to learn about what makes color design, which I can't go into here. So if you want to learn all of these things and much more about what makes really great color, then check out my complete illustration art course. If I wanted to introduce even more shapes, like the tree, for example, and let's say I add it back here, like this. So now I have a tree shape. And then maybe this boat here in the distance. Now I have yet another shape. And then maybe this flower here. Maybe add that over here. So now I have an additional shape. Now I have too many shapes. I no longer have that economy of shapes that I started out with. Now this rough sketch looks cluttered. And this is what beginners do. They put too much in there, too many different objects, too many different shapes, and they end up with a cluttered looking picture that doesn't have one of the most important principles of design, which is economy. Pattern is what you need to get into your pictures. As the great Bernie Fuchs once said, pattern is what you hang a picture on. There is no picture without pattern. So what I showed you here was that I took a shape, the sailboat, and I repeated it, and it forms a pattern. You take one shape, you repeat it with variation, and you create a varied pattern. If you repeat that shape without any variation, so that this sailboat looks exactly the same when you repeat it again and again, you have repetition. But you also have a pattern. You have a pattern without variation, which isn't a very interesting pattern. Let's say, for example, I have something like this, and this is a cactus. And over here, I have this mountain. And back here, I have yet some more mountains. And then I have a horizon over here. And in the distance, there are more mountains. What I have here is 3 patterns. 1, 2, 3. This mountain is a pattern because what I've done is I've repeated the same shape and form, which is this. This is the shape, and it has a cylinder-like form. It's curved like this, and I've repeated it. It's very rough here, but by repeating that shape, varying it also, some are wider, some are shorter, some are longer, some are more narrow. I've introduced a varied pattern. I've repeated the shape and form, but with variations, thereby introducing economy also. I didn't introduce any other shapes or forms. Therefore, I have this pattern here. And then I have a pattern over here as well of this cactus that has a similar shape and form to these mountains back here. And this is very rough. What I'm doing here is I'm duplicating in a very rough way a great illustration by the great illustrator of the past, Fred Ludekens. And when I saw this painting, I really began to understand the importance of pattern and how to create it so that it is interesting, so that it has this kind of variation that I'm talking about. So now I have this pattern here, but then when you look back here, there's also a pattern, but it's different. It has a different shape to it. It has these triangle-like shapes that are repeated again and again. So these mountains back there form this pattern of these triangle-like shapes. So each one of these sections of his painting has a different pattern, or is made up of a pattern, although this pattern and this one are very similar. But the objects are different. This object is a cactus, this is a mountain, and these are also mountains. Now this is very rough, as you can see. But I think you get the idea here. The importance of establishing patterns. Everything is put down in patterns. In nature, nothing exists in an isolated state. Everything is part of a pattern, some kind of pattern. That's a law of nature. So therefore, when you create your pictures, you also must make your shapes and forms part of a pattern. Now here I carry this sketch a little bit further. These mountains in the background actually form another pattern. See the curving shapes and these sphere-like forms. You have to be familiar with the basic forms, and you'll learn all about those in my complete illustration art course. And each one of these distant mountains is repeated, as you can see. Right now they look very similar. To make them more interesting, variations need to be introduced, like making this one larger in size, for example, and maybe stretching this one out more, like that. So now they look somewhat different, but they haven't lost their association with each other. They haven't been changed radically. All similar things in nature group together, and grouping is part of creating a pattern. Patterns exist in groups. All similar things in nature congregate together to form patterns. Grouping, in other words, is what you need to establish a pattern. You can see in this rough sketch of the painting by the great Fred Ludekens, who was one of the guiding faculties of the famous artist schools where I worked. And that was the greatest time working there and meeting many of the great artists. That was a time in which many of the guiding faculty came to the school and gave lectures. And I was fortunate enough to be able to hear some of those lectures and learn from these great artists. In this sketch here, which is a copy, and very roughly done, of course, from what the original looks like, you can see that Fred Ludekens grouped all of these mountains together, forming a pattern, as I mentioned. And the same thing happens here. These mountains are grouped together, and the cactus is grouped together. So when you set up a pattern, you also need to group those shapes and forms that make that pattern, just like Fred Ludekens did here. Now, you can see that Fred Ludekens was applying this principle of economy, of not having a large number of different shapes. These shapes and these are basically the same with variations, and then he has these triangular shapes here, and then these more curving shapes in the far distance. But actually in his painting you hardly see those. I made them a little too large. They're way back in the distance, so you can hardly see them. You can see what a limited number of shapes he's using, and that he groups them into a pattern. Unless you understand this thoroughly and are able to apply it to your own drawings and paintings, they will never go beyond the beginner stage. You'll always remain at that beginner stage if you're unable to apply what I've shown you in this video. Now, in order to understand all this even better, to get an even better grasp on this most important subject of economy and pattern and repetition and variation and novelty, check out my complete illustration art course, in which I go into this even more. The more examples you see, the more that is explained to you, the better your understanding of all of this will be. So here are the limited number of shapes he uses. So it's basically this shape and this shape, and then the mountains in the far distance are shaped like that. So he's using 3 shapes, but then he's varying those shapes when he repeats them. Makes some of them wider, like you see here, some of them taller, like that, and more narrow. And the same goes for this shape. He makes some more narrow. He's repeating that shape. He's not adding a different object and a different shape to the mountain over here, but he's taking that shape and then he's just repeating it with variations. He makes this one shorter. He makes this one taller. And then maybe another one a little taller than this one, but wider than this one. It's these kind of variations that make for an interesting picture. And then the distant mountains are also repeated, some a little taller, some a little more narrow, variations of the mountain shape in the distance. And these repetitions of the shape and form, they also have form. It's not just shape, but also form that is being repeated with variations. And this kind of repetition forms a pattern. That's a pattern, that's a pattern, this is a pattern. So he is working in a very economical way by just selecting 3 shapes and then repeating them with variations as I've shown you, and placing them close together, which groups them and forms a pattern. The pattern is formed because they are all similar. They all look similar, and therefore a pattern is formed. I could give these mountains here form so that they have volume by adding a shadow to them like this, for example, and now they look three-dimensional. And I could add a core shadow here, which helps to make them look even more three-dimensional. And the same I could do for these mountains here by adding a shadow to them and giving them form. So the form is also repeated and varied. Very important that you learn what the basic forms are and how to use them to construct objects with. And you can learn all that from my complete illustration art course. And the same for the distant mountains. However, the distant mountains are going to appear more flat. Form flattens out the further back you get in space. So mountains that are very far back, they're going to look flat. They're not going to have the same kind of volume or solidity that the forms have in the foreground. They won't have that three-dimensional appearance like this form that is in the foreground here. While these mountains right now, they look like they have too much form, so I could flatten them out a bit like that. They're going to appear less like a three-dimensional form and more flat-looking in the far distance. I've added a few more of these mountains, and what I want to explain to you here is that when shapes and forms are overlapping each other, like you see here, or if they're near each other, like these, this one and that one is near these, then they become part of a group. However, you can have that similar shape and form further away from a large group like this. So I could have, let's say, these couple of mountains over here that are quite a distance away from this large group, and these mountains will still appear as part of this group, even though they are much further away. So in this painting by Fred Ludekens, if he, let's say, placed these mountains further away, like, for example, right there, he adds a couple, or let's say 3 mountains that are quite a distance away from this main group here of mountains. All these mountains have been grouped together, just like I showed you over here. So if he places the same kind of shape and form of the mountain over here, a distance away, these mountains will still be part of that group because they have the same shape and form, or similar shape and form, as these do. Like in this example here, even though I placed these mountains much further away from the main group here, they still appear as part of the group because they have a similar shape and form, like these shapes and forms have. So you don't always have to place all of the shapes and forms that are similar next to each other or overlap them like this to be part of a group. You can also place some of them further away and they will still be part of the group, the main group. However, if I add a different kind of shape, something like this, for example, where there are these curved shapes, this doesn't appear as though it belongs to this group because the shapes are too different. As long as the shapes and forms are similar to the main group, and placed further away from the main group, they will appear as though they are part of that main group, of that larger group. When you look at these shapes and then you look at these, you get the same feeling that these shapes and forms belong to this group as you do when you look at these shapes and forms. I think you can see that these don't seem to belong to this group, while these do. And this is very important when you are constructing your picture, when you are creating a composition or designing a composition. All of these things that I've been showing you must be included within the composition or drawing or painting. All great pictures, all good pictures have these things. And if you ignore them, if you are unable to get them into your work, then your drawings and paintings are not going to be very good. They're going to remain at that beginner level. So none of this can be ignored. If it seems too difficult to understand right now, you have to keep at it until you get that understanding that is necessary. In art, it's all about different levels of understanding. A beginner's level of understanding is way down here. But then as the beginner gains more knowledge and he begins to understand that knowledge, and as he adds more and more knowledge to what he has already learned, his understanding grows, and therefore he reaches higher levels of understanding in art. And at a certain level, his work is no longer going to appear amateurish. He will have reached that level that will enable him to produce really good work, and even great work, if that is his or her destiny. Instead of having 2 or 3 shapes to work with that you create variations from, you could just use one shape, like the sailboat again. Only the sailboat. No figures, no flowers or anything, or bushes or anything like that, just the sailboat itself. So you have one object. And I'm just going to do a rough sketch here, really rough. So you're looking down on this sailboat, this big sail in the front, and then a triangle shaped sail in the rear. And then I could add another sailboat here. Again, I'm just using the sailboat shape, and I'm varying it. So here is the second sailboat, and maybe that shape is a little bit different, something like this maybe, and there's a flag on the top of the mast. And then I'll repeat that sailboat shape again back here to give a great distance to this picture. So that sailboat is very small compared to the one up front and to this one. So now I have 3 sailboats, and then I could add variations within the sailboat shapes themselves, such as, for example, adding some kind of pattern here onto this sailboat, while this one back here doesn't have that kind of pattern, and the small one in the distance doesn't have a pattern either. However, this sailboat might have a darker value, like that, a darker sail. So I'm adding some tonal variation. The foreground sail is light in value. The sky I'm going to darken a little bit. This helps to make the white stand out more on that foreground sailboat. You see the variations that can be added. And this boat can be made darker, and then a reflection added, and some reflections from those boats in the distance can also be added. I'm going to do a little more work on this rough sketch, but you won't see me doing that work because otherwise the video is going to run too long. So therefore, after I've carried this sketch to a bit more of a finished state, I'm going to show you what it looks like. So I'm going to jump ahead now and show you what I did. Here's what it looks like. Still not a finished painting, still a rough sketch, but you can see what can be done with a limited number of shapes. You select a shape like I did, and then you repeat that shape with variations, and you introduce novelty. Now, I've introduced novelty within this picture. Can you see where that novelty is? The novelty is the seagulls that I've added, as well as the figure over here. You can add more than just one novelty. And the seagulls represent an additional shape that I added. And then there is the shape of the figure here as well. You can add more than just one or two shapes to a composition. But don't add so many different objects with so many different shapes that you end up with basically a mess, chaos, a cluttered looking picture that lacks the economy that is the hallmark of a really good or great picture. Each restatement of this shape, or it can also be thought of in terms of an idea. So each restatement of an idea or a shape, or you can think of it in terms of an element of design, contributes something new and valuable to the painting. The restatement of an element of design, such as in this case shape or an idea, presents an opportunity to the artist for exploring what kind of variations can be made from that element of design. In any good painting, you will find the essential elements repeated time and again in slightly new and different forms throughout the work, such as I'm showing you here in this rough sketch. I've repeated the sailboat with variations of size, and each sailboat looks somewhat different. And I also used parts of the sailboats where you don't see the entire sailboat, you just see the sail here and over here. And these sails act as a kind of frame for the center of interest here. The technique of variation permits the artist to be economical.